organizing an event like this is getting to meet people like Elder Lorna and the next person that I'm going to introduce you to. It's my pleasure right now to introduce you to Liz Weaver. Liz, in many respects, needs no introduction. She is the co-CEO of Tamarack Institute and strategic lead responsible for their learning center. And when our organizing team first sat down to brainstorm individuals and organizations to invite to be part of this project, we all looked at each other and said, wouldn't it be great if we could get the Tamarack Institute to be a part of this? As many of you know, the Tamarack Institute is synonymous with phrases like social change, collective impact, and we were so delighted when we reached out to Liz, and almost immediately she said yes to us and was always so gracious with her time and advice in helping our planning team put this event together. Her organizing skills are second to none, and we really appreciated that help. And the Tamarack Institute was founded in 2001. For those of you that don't know, I guess that means you're celebrating a 20th anniversary this year. And to support community change makers to have an impact. Change makers. I think that is what all of us who are gathering here today hope we can call ourselves. That the work we are doing matters, that we're contributing to positive change and making an impact through the work in the communities that we do, in the communities we live in and identify with. So prior to her current roles with Tamarack, Liz led the Vibrant Communities Canada team and provided coaching, leadership, and support to community partners across the country. In her career, she was director for the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, which was a collective impact initiative. And it was recognized with the Canadian Urban Institute's Leadership Award in 2009. And she's also held leadership positions with YWCA Hamilton, Volunteer Canada. And she's been recognized so many times, but most notably being awarded Queen's Jubilee medals, not once, but twice in 2002 and 2012. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Liz now, who, again, we're just so delighted that she could join us today. And if you have any questions for Liz, you can pop them into the chat box, and we'll have time at the end for some questions. Take it away, Liz.
Thanks so much, Lynn, and hi, everybody. I know lots of you are off camera today. I want to acknowledge Elder Lorna's talk this morning and the stories that you shared with us and the medicines that you shared with us. I was very inspired, and it is so little time and you have so much to tell. So let us know about the podcast, because I'm an avid podcast listener, and I'd really like to listen to your podcast as well. So maybe that's something that that you can share out, Lynn, after this session. So I'm going to talk about post-pandemic communities and really try to talk about, okay, so what do we need to be thinking about as we go through this work, and really thinking about what are the opportunities that we have for societal transformation. That's the essence of my talk, and it's really my pleasure. I've been involved with Carleton University and other initiatives. Tamarack had the great good fortune a number of years ago to be a community partner on a SHRC grant, a SHRC funded grant that really looked at communities first. And I think this work builds on that foundation. And so we have a connection into universities and into really thinking about the link between the campus environment and the community environment, and how we can make that more proactive. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on Indigenous lands, and that we're very grateful for the opportunity to meet on these lands. I, in particular, are joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. And this land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. And I love that kind of reminder that we have that around the Great Lakes, that is the dish, and we all eat from that dish. And so, you know, we have a role to play in stewarding our environment and really taking care of our environment. And that's the wisdom that I bring into my life on a daily basis. So wanted to acknowledge that. And I welcome you to also acknowledge the lands, the traditional lands that you're joining us from. So Lynn, you did a great job in talking about Tamarack. For those of you that don't know our work, we have two pieces of our work that really drive us as an organization forward these last 20 years. The first part is actually at the bottom of the screen, and that's the place-based work that we do. And we work with leaders across 400 different communities in Canada, in the United States, and even in the global footprint. And, you know, we're really interested in what it takes to take a whole of community approach to ending poverty, to deepening community, to building youth futures. And more recently, we launched a climate transitions focus for our work. And we really believe that it is the wisdom of all peoples in the communities, of all citizens of the communities, to drive this work forward in partnership with anchor institutions like libraries and universities and nonprofit organizations. And so it's that kind of wisdom that we need to draw on if we want to solve these really challenging problems that we face in our communities. And then the part I lead at Tamarack is the Learning Center. And Lynn talked about this. It's really, we're very interested in all of you and what it takes to be an active community change maker. And I would argue, Lynn, that everybody in this virtual room are change makers. They wouldn't be here if they weren't, because they have a passion and they care about communities so deeply and they care about their work. And so we have landed on 5 interconnected practices for change makers, and you can see that on the slide today. But it really is, you know, thinking about how can we build our skills in these areas, or how can we draw on others who have the skills in these areas to really deepen the change that we want to see in our communities, where communities are welcoming, healthy, and vibrant places. So that's Tamarack. So I'm going to do 3 things today. I'm going to talk about things that emerged during the pandemic and what we observed in this work across Tamarack and across the communities that we work with. So what happened, and what are things that, if we're thinking about the community environment and really trying to transform that campus community relationship and seize this moment of change, what would that look like? I'm going to share with you some themes and then talk about pivoting post pandemic and really see if we can transform in a way that makes a big difference. And so here are some leadership forms that emerged during the pandemic. And these are drawn from a paper that some colleagues and I wrote a number of months ago. As we were kind of halfway through the pandemic, we were starting to look at our communities and say, hey, what's happening? How are communities and individuals in communities responding? And so my colleagues at the Civic Canopy in Denver, Colorado, and those of us at Tamarack kind of got together and we said, what are we seeing? And we saw 3 types of leadership emerge. And we think that these are important to track and important to kind of try to understand, particularly as we kind of move forward post-pandemic. And so they're responsive leadership, collaborative or collective leadership. And then the third form is disruptive and emergent leadership. And so responsive leadership, this happened in Hamilton, but it also happened in many communities across Canada and the United States. It's kind of this group of individuals who said, hey, there are people hurting in my community. I'm going to step up and respond in a way that I can respond. I'm going to bring some other people around me, and we're going to try to meet those direct needs. And these were kind of individual acts or small collective acts of leadership that we saw. They're nodes. And what's really interesting, in Hamilton, it was called Caremongering Hamilton. And so you could see on Facebook every day someone saying, hey, I have a need, or, you know, I don't have enough food to get me to the end of the week. And a whole bunch of other people saying, hey, I've got some things in my pantry that I'm not going to use. I can drop them off, or you can pick them up on my porch. And every day there was this kind of conversation, and there continues to be this ongoing conversation of individual acts of people who have needs and then people who can respond. So responsive leadership really did emerge in the early days of the pandemic, and continues to be something that we see in our communities. The second form of leadership that got strengthened during the pandemic, it existed prior to the pandemic, but it actually was strengthened, was these circles of caring, these collective groups that are already in place in communities, when communities were trying to figure out how to, you know, support individuals in the community. They went to these collaborative tables and they said, hey, collaborative tables, can you do this? Or can you be a mechanism through which we can connect with individuals in the community? And what I heard from collaborative tables was that people also who might have been on the fringes of those collaborative tables started to look to those collaborative tables and say, can I join because I need a connection point, or I need to have some of that connection. I'm, you know, working from home now. I don't necessarily see my peers. So this collaborative table became even more relevant to their work, and they saw their memberships increase and they saw their relevance in communities increase. And then the third form of leadership that we've seen emerge, and this is, you know, somewhat in response to some of the events that we've all witnessed as part of the pandemic. The first event that we've witnessed is that the pandemic doesn't impact all individuals in an equal kind of way. Even though government has said we're all in this together, there are people that are more deeply impacted as a result of the pandemic. And so this unequalness started to have some of us ask deeper questions about how we might navigate our way through the unequalness. The other thing that came out of the pandemic, or actually came out of other events, was events like when George Floyd was murdered in the United States. Again, people coming out into the streets and saying, hey, this is not acceptable and we need to change. You know, we need to enter into this conversation around equity and racial justice and social justice. And so this type of leadership is a disruptive, emergent kind of leadership. There are people that are saying, hey, we're not satisfied anymore with the status quo. We need changes, and we need the changes to be big and dramatic. And so, you know, it's interesting as we think about, you know, pivoting post-pandemic, these types of leaderships, how do we in communities and how do we in campus environments really lean into these forms of leadership that have emerged and really grow the capacity of leaders in each of the areas and support the leadership that is emerging, and adding our voice to their voices so that they can even be stronger and more impactful. You know, there are some things to kind of consider in when we reflected on these forms of leadership. And these were the questions that we asked in the paper that we wrote, the Tamarack Institute and the Civic Canopy in Colorado. We wanted to kind of think about what are the trends, shifts, and opportunities that we might have missed? What are the things that you all have seen in your leadership? Or what are some of the trends and the opportunities that have kind of happened in communities where we've missed an opportunity? And I really think, you know, the Seizing the Moment two-day conference is a great time for us to reflect on that type of a question. So what has happened? What have we learned from what has just happened? And then as we move forward into kind of a post-pandemic world, how do we intentionally seek the moment to really drive change forward in a deeper kind of way? How can we best join our voices and join our forces rooted in our local context, but really looking at what are the opportunities that are presenting themselves? So the different types of leaderships help us reflect on how communities respond, but they also challenge us to look at, the future and to ask some really tough questions about the future. The other thing that we did at Tamarack was we started to say, okay, so the pandemic has happened, but can we learn some lessons from the communities that we're supporting or engaged with? Or as we look across the network of communities in Canada, what can we learn from them? And so we spent some time, in April, May, and June of last year, not doing the work that we typically do at Tamarack, but we spent some time really reflecting on the stories. And weekly, we would print this newsletter and we would print it online, and then we would share it with all of our stakeholders. And it really looked at the kind of duality of COVID-19 and being in isolation and community building. And what could we learn from that? So what were communities actually doing in real time? What were the challenges that they were facing and how were they overcoming those? And so we pivoted to really capture those community stories, and they really enriched our work. It led my colleague Paul Bourne to talk about and write about this notion of community becoming unessential. And so as we all went into our homes, working from home, not being able to connect with other people, not being able to meet folks and hug them like we used to in those early waves of the pandemic. And even in Ontario right now, we're still, in our homes. He kind of talked about in one of his blog posts, it seems like community is becoming unessential. And in his blog, he started to think about, okay, so what would it take to decide that in fact we are missing a lot of things through the pandemic, and that we do need these links, these connections. We need to be in touch with one another. We need to really build community in a way that can make a big difference. And so here are just some ideas that he posed in the article that he wrote about community being such an essential component. And we know, if you look at the trends around mental health and social isolation and loneliness, we certainly have seen those increase, the incidences of those increase during the pandemic. And could we imagine a different response that still allowed us to connect to one another and still allowed us to be in these big round balls, maybe meeting each other on the street corner? So yeah, it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about community and thinking about what our response could have been. We went further in that and in our thinking to build this guide, a 10 guide. And this is really a combination of stories. So it's 10 good ideas, 10 inspiring stories, and 10 useful resources that really came out of the COVID-19 and community building experience that we put together, because we thought that there was such great innovation that we saw across communities and across the work of communities. And so here are the 10 good ideas, or 9 of them. But it really is important to kind of think about, how do we gather together? How do we purposefully and intentionally not let this crisis go to waste? And I think this conference is one way, one very practical way, where we're joining with one another. We're reflecting on what has happened. We're reflecting on the campus community experience, and then trying to think about, okay, so what can the future hold for us? There's some other great examples in here of building momentum and building a path forward for your community, for the work that you're doing, whether you're in a campus community environment or a community-based environment or a hybrid, a campus community environment, to really think about how do we build our skills and competencies in these areas. The other thing that we did in this resource is that we kind of reflected on 10 community stories. And so the stories really are the depth and breadth of our country and reflect what communities did to respond to the pandemic. So in St. John, New Brunswick, they started to mobilize the social capital that they have in their community and deepened partnerships and relationships. In Lethbridge, again, mobilizing citizens. In Leeds and Grenville, they developed a training program for their communities, community members and community leaders to prepare them to pivot post COVID-19. And in Kitchener, they looked at embedding an environmental lens into their decision making. So each of the community stories in the 10 guide really are examples of communities using the opportunity of the pandemic to be a bit more reflective and to respond to things that are really impacting their communities. So they're really great stories, and I invite you to download the guide and read a little bit more about how communities are maybe making that premise that Paul had, that communities will continue to be essential, really leaning into that premise that he had. So how do we pivot post-pandemic? And so these are just some things that we've been thinking about at Tamarack, and hopefully they are helpful to you as you continue to think about your community change work or your campus community change work. The first thing that we think about is that communities are complex adaptive systems. And so if you look at the kind of complexity area there, you know, sometimes the relationship between the cause and the effect can only be seen post. And so that's why it's important for us to kind of look back at the decisions and the choices that we made at the beginning of the pandemic and during the pandemic, and really kind of thinking about what were the things that worked really well, and then how do we bring that, those ideas, those stories, that way of working forward into our work. It's really about probing and asking some of those probing questions, sensing what happened, and then building a response that's really built on, you know, what are the capacities that we have now, what happened in the past, and how can we leverage those forward. And it is in some ways about, and in many ways about, emergent practice. Tamarack had this challenge during the pandemic of thinking about our strategic plan. And so we built during the course of the pandemic with our board of directors and with over 200 stakeholders, our Tamarack 2030 plan. And one of the essential parts of the Tamarack 2030 plan was this work that we did with our colleague Mark Cabage around scenario planning. And so Mark says that there are 3 potential scenarios that all of us may be impacted by post-pandemic. And this was really helpful to us at Tamarack, might also be helpful to you. So we went from stability, we had this big disruption of the pandemic, and you know, there are, if you read social media or if you read articles, there is this big push to return to the old equilibrium. Even though we know that that old equilibrium is one that might not have the right context around social justice or around equity, but there is this big push, you know, that we have this instinct that we all have about returning to something that we feel is safe and that is knowing to us and relevant to us. Another scenario might be that, you know, yes, there is the old equilibrium, but could we push forward and find a new equilibrium? What are the lessons that we've learned during the pandemic that will take us to a new space and a new equilibrium? And or the third scenario that we explored at Tamarack is that this disruption is just one of many disruptions that we're going to face into the future. So how do we build our skills, our capacities, our knowledge, to really be able to manage these disruptions that may occur over time. And we're already seeing these disruptions emerge, right? So we've had the pandemic disruption. We've also seen people that have lost their employment because of the pandemic. We've seen philanthropic organizations spend a lot of money to kind of manage stability, and governments at different levels manage the stability of the pandemic. And we know that those will have economic consequences. So we might see some economic disruptions going into the future. And we know, because of, all the conversations around climate, that there are climate disruptions in the future as well. And so how do we build our skills and abilities to manage new disequilibriums and new disruptions? And so these three types of futures are really helpful in terms of thinking about, well, where will we land? We probably won't land in any of them individually, but we will land in many of them collectively, or in parts of them in different kinds of ways. And so thinking about scenarios as we go forward, and using scenario planning as we go forward, is a really interesting way to plan our work, plan our campus community work, our collective work kind of going forward, recognizing that there will be these shifts and disruptions as we go forward. So what do we do? How do we kind of lean into this? There are things that we can consider, and this comes from a paper that I wrote around how collective impact, what are the lessons we can learn from collective impact? And one of my colleagues, Paul Schmitz, talked about 3 skills or 3 things to do when we have these deep disruptions. And one is to lean in with empathy, to really understand that different colleagues are going through this in different kinds of ways. We can certainly, in Ontario, at Tamarack, we have lots of parents with very young children. And so every time the school system shuts down, that has an impact with them. So how do we as an organization lean in with empathy and support them, or support people who might be having mental health issues relative to the pandemic and the feeling of not being safe? So that's a critical response. The second response that Paul talks about is this notion of putting your oxygen mask on first. And I think that these are really wise words. Those of us who travel on planes, that's one of the instructions that the flight attendants tell us, to put our oxygen mask on first and then help others around us. And, the notion of this is that you cannot be a helper to others if you are not helping yourself as well. And so how do you create kind of your own emotional safety and really pay attention to that, so that you have the capacity to also bring the strength and the empathy to others and support others in this work? And then the final thing that Paul talks about is really the idea of the collective experience and the collective networks, and how can we draw on those? And I think what's really cool about, the 2 days together is the range of perspectives that you're bringing into the room to really think about this work. So here are some other things that we raised in this paper. How do we think about putting people first? What are the equity issues that we have to pay attention to? How do we invest in community infrastructure? And as you begin to think your way through, seizing the moment, these are areas that you might want to think about. And how do we, continue to, on those forms of leadership, continue to protect and expand community voice and community power? There's lots of things that we can do in this work. And so it is really kind of considering the opportunities that we have in front of us. This is just another way of thinking about it, but asking yourself some really important questions. Am I okay? Is my family okay? What are the things that we needed to do when we responded? What are the things that we need to do as we go through this to recover? And then how do we build resiliency? And I think, I would say that we're more in the recovery and leaning into the resilience phase. And so really kind of considering these questions and these opportunities. Before I finish, I just wanted to share with you 2 frameworks that I actually kind of like, and I think, you know, sometimes we talk in abstract and frameworks can help us kind of orient ourselves and say, you know, what do we need to be paying attention to, and or what can we let go of. And so the first framework is a framework that is developed by the RSA, and it's about planning in a crisis, right? And so this really gets us to think about, okay, so what do we need to end, what do we need to amplify, what do we need to let go, and what do we need to restart. And so often we just keep adding things on and we don't ask ourselves these questions, and they're such important questions. You know, what can we amplify going forward, but what do we let go of? You know, what didn't actually work, what didn't what can we say, hey, you know, during the pandemic we learned all these new things, but we also can let go of these other practices that don't work very well. So a great framework to consider, you know, this work. Another one that comes more from the environmental sector is this notion of these different kinds of zones. And so it's really looking at the red zone, the blue zone, or the blue ocean, the Gulf Stream drift, and the green forest. And you, again, it's the red zone is things that really crowd the marketplace. The blue zone is the opportunity zone. The Gulf Stream are the areas of innovation that have emerged during the pandemic that you can draw into. And the green forest is where you might move forward. And so again, another way that you can use, another tool that you can use for planning for opportunity. And so now I'm going to kind of end my talk and open it up to questions or conversation. But this is, you know, as I was thinking about joining you today and really thinking about the work that, you know, Tamarack has observed, participated in, and reflected on, what does this mean for campus community engagement and for transformation in this area? And so, you know, here are some things that I would love to see happen, and I'm sure there are others that you could add to this list. But how do we advocate collectively for more human-centered approaches to building back better? So how do we really understand, you know, what is needed in our communities, building for people, building for equity, building for knowledge, building for capacity, and so that our communities are richer as a result of this, and that our campus environments are richer as a result of that. And that is really more human-centered, because we know, you know, as part of this pandemic that we've all experienced, that it was an unequal impact. And so part of this is also advocating for a more equal approach, or to also recognize that those that were impacted more deeply, how can we help them? How can they move to the front and some of us move to the back? How do we leverage the shared knowledge of our campus and community, and recognizing that there is wisdom in both? There's lots of wisdom that is, you know, within a campus environment, but there's a ton of wisdom also in the community. And those of you in the room, I know you know this, but how do we create that conversation that is even broader and deeper? How do we design opportunities that create equity, that deepen engagement, and that build capacity? What are the mindset shifts that are really required? You know, one of the things in this process, Lynn, that I learned this term about academic activists. I'd never heard that term before, and I probably should have, given all my connections with all of you. But how do we recognize the value and the role of academic activists, those academics who really believe in the strength of community change, but sometimes that's not recognized within the campus environment? How do we lift that up? How does the community say that this is so critical to us, really adds value to the community, and to really start to advocate from a community perspective the importance of these academic activists or advocates? What is the value and the role of community-based organizations, and how do we lift that up? And also the value and the role of student researchers. And I know, Amber, at the beginning of the session today, you recognized the student researchers that were engaged with this initiative, and Tamarack has really benefited from research as well, student researchers in our work, and so particularly in our poverty reduction work. And so how do we really recognize that, value that, and ensure that that is lifted up in the way that is so important? And then finally, you know, if you think about the zones, the ocean zone, planning for opportunity approach, how do we get prepared? How do we align ourselves for action? Where are those other nodes of conversation, the ones that are happening around the tables, the university and community tables that the McConnell Family Foundation is engaged in, but where are those other nodes of conversation, and how can we join these conversations up and really connect them so that we have a purposeful approach? Because there will be things shifting post-pandemic, and we have to be prepared for these shifts. And the way that we get prepared is through sessions like this, but then we also get prepared in real partnerships in the community. So I'm going to stop there. I know that there were some things that were put in the chat box, Lynn, so I'll turn it back over to you. But I really hope that, you know, the next steps will emerge from some of the things that I've raised today.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that wonderful presentation. And there's been a couple comments in the chat box about that point exactly, just how great your presentation was. And we will at some point, I think Magda is going to be completely tired out the next couple of days, but eventually we're going to be putting all of the presentations up on the Community Campus Engage Canada website. So anyone who's interested will be able to see Liz's presentation there. I'd like to open it up now for questions. You provided a lot of food for thought, Liz. Is anyone out there like to, I'm going to try to see if I can see people's hands, but please unmute yourself if you have any questions. This is such an artificial environment that it's still very daunting to try to ask a question in this kind of environment, but I'm sure there must be some people out there that have questions.
Yep, we've got a couple. So Jane, I saw you raise your hand first, and then Amy, yeah, you're next. So how about you, Jane?
Thank you so much. That was totally amazing. And, you know, I had a hard time to keep up with you. I already want to hear it all over again. But, you know, the thing that struck me the most in the context of this event is how do we identify those opportunities? Like some of them, I feel like they're whipping by us already. And how do we, you know, how do we grasp which are the right ones for us right now? How can we bring other people along with us? I mean, you know, the change makers, the agents for change, you know, they're not necessarily the most popular people in the world. There's lots of resistance. So how do we grab these opportunities and move forward?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Jane. I think it is, part of it is to engage in conversations with others, which is what, you know, this session is all about. Because when we engage in conversations with others, we see things through different eyes and through different lenses, right? So that is so important. And particularly people that we haven't talked to in the past, right? We're often drawn to the people that we talk to all the time. And I think it is bringing in the other voices of people who might have been impacted more deeply. What has their experience been? And I think it is about reflecting first. What did we do really well? What are the new things that we learned in our own responses to the pandemic? What maybe didn't work quite so well? Who got left behind? And then as we move forward, it's not about jumping on every opportunity, but it's actually being very strategic. So given who we have in the room, what our competencies are, what our interests are, what is the thing that if we could imagine something, you know, in 2 years, what is that thing that we really want to focus on collectively together? Is it that we want a more equitable community, or is it that we want to, you know, build a better food system in our community, or whatever the what is, that we come to some consensus around the what? You know, in collective impact, they call it the common agenda. I think you have to kind of not do too many things, but really say, okay, collectively, what, come to agreement on the what, and then figure out the how that goes behind the what. And also think about what you can let go. And, you know, I say to a lot of the communities that I work with, because we go through kind of that ideation phase about, you know, what are all the opportunities that we have in front of us? And sometimes it can be death by 1,000 opportunities, right? There are so many opportunities, but we really have to think strategically, you know, what's the opportunity that will get us further faster? And sometimes if you don't have a lot of collaborative muscle, you do the easy things first, and then you take on, you know, more and more difficult things, or more and more challenging things. And so that's the way that I like to enter into this work, to think about, okay, so what can we do first, and then what's next, and what's next, and what's next, right? And then, you know, how do we bring the folks together around those things that we're doing that are successful? And nothing builds momentum like momentum, eh? So those are just some ideas that I have. Amy, you're next, and then Cindy, I see your hand up, so I'll call on you next. How does that sound?
Thanks so much, Liz. My big question, I come from the University of Calgary. Obviously, we're currently, all of our post-secondaries are being challenged in a multitude of different ways. So what is your experience working with partners or organizations, institutions that aren't the choir? Right now, we're sitting around with very like-minded, collaborative partners and colleagues. How are you working with people that maybe are a little bit less willing?
So I believe that they are critical voices to bring into the conversation. And they're hard for us because we don't necessarily, we probably know them, but we probably don't feel comfortable with them in the conversation. They bring a different understanding to this work, right? So they might uncover for us some of our unconscious biases. They might raise for us some issues that we hadn't necessarily considered. And what they also do is they help us get more clarity on the thing that we might want to move forward on. So, you know, Lynn mentioned, prior to my joining Tamarack, I led an initiative in Hamilton called the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. And around that table, of 40 leaders, we had 10 people with the lived experience of poverty, 10 business leaders, 10 government leaders, and 10 community leaders. And what we really wanted to do in the early stage of that work was change the nature of the conversation that we were having in the city of Hamilton around poverty, because it wasn't a conversation that happened in all of those circles. And so, you know, by bringing business leaders and individuals with the lived experience of poverty together, we started to have deeper conversations about what it meant to live that experience, but also what were some of the barriers that business leaders were facing when they were trying to build economic prosperity in the community. And so we had those two different lenses around the table. And I think, you know, we often shy away from voices that don't agree with us. And I think it's such an important thing to bring those voices in, because their lens, their perspective, how they're navigating the world is so important to us to understand what possible solutions we might be able to build together. Right? Because they, particularly, you know, one of the things I learned from the folks with the lived experience of poverty is they are navigating systems or navigating around them, right? And so that's interesting, and that can be helpful to say, okay, these systems are not working. If they're navigating around them, if children and families are navigating around these systems, clearly the systems aren't working. Someone made the rules. How can we make the systems work better for people, right? You know, and just one more thing I'm going to say before I leave that, you know, we learned in our work in Hamilton and in the work of poverty reduction in Ontario at the time that there were 900 different rules that people who had the lived experience of poverty had to navigate. Probably are still around that number, maybe even more. 900. Not like many of us have rules in our lives, you know, we have to get a driver's license and, you know, you need a passport to travel. But just think about if there were 900 of them that were impacting your life on a daily basis, what that would mean for you as a citizen in a community and what that does to your voice and your ability to have control over your future. And it wasn't until I was engaged in those conversations that I got that deeper understanding of that. And then that changed how I, you know, lived and worked and contributed to the work of community change. And I think it's that kind of deeper understanding that really gets us to better solutions for our communities. So there you go. Cindy.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for your words. It was a wonderful talk. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Regina and sitting in Treaty 6 right now, and Treaty 6 land. So I'm interested, you talk briefly about caregiving or caremongering, sorry. While I think we need a lot more attention to care and the notion that it's played in the pandemic, I think there's another notion that's had much less attention, and that's the notion of mutual aid or solidarity. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about those different approaches and, you know, where post-pandemic we put our energies.
Yeah, you know, there is a long history in Canada of mutual aid. We see it in a whole bunch of different movements in Canada. I'm probably a little bit less conversant about the depth and the history of mutual aid, but it certainly is something that at Tamarack, you know, we in our work, in our community-based work, we really value and support and invest in what we call the voice of people with lived and living experience. That's how we talk about the work. And that's true for our poverty reduction work. It's true for our communities building youth futures work and our deepening community work and now climate transitions. And in many ways, what we've learned through our poverty reduction work, that a lot of solutions that can come from community can come through that voice, right? Can be really raised up through that voice. And in fact, individuals can support one another in that experience, right? There are opportunities to really invest in peer learning, in peer mutual aid. The challenge that we saw in the paper that we wrote with, you know, my colleagues at the Civic Canopy is thinking about the sustainability of mutual aid approaches over a longer period of time, right? And so often what has happened, I think, in Canada is that a lot of our voluntary sector organizations actually started because people were interested in an area or doing something together. They supported one another, and then that after a period of time that became an organization, and the folks kind of in some ways dropped away from that experience. And so, you know, how do we kind of continue to support caremongering, continue to recognize that that is part of who we are. we have this mutual capacity in our work, or this mutual aid way of being, but also thinking about, that there are other forms of leadership that can emerge. I'm not sure I've really answered your question. It's such a good question. I'm going to think about it a little bit more, but it is a really good question because it is something that I think about, that I thought about relative to the paper, was that the resilience, the sustainability, the accessibility. And it seems to me, this might be something that we could reflect on even more. It seems to me that technology is enabling mutual aid in some ways, but it's also being a barrier in others, right? So depending on where you are situated in Canada, you might be able to use technology, as they did in Hamilton, to have these just-in-time mutual aid responses. But in other places across the country, there is a larger digital divide. And so, Tamarack does some work in communities like Yellowknife, Iqaluit, and Whitehorse and Digby, Nova Scotia, where, access to technology for young people, even the tools and resources of having their own computer and having web access creates a divide for them. And we've seen that emerge even more in the pandemic. And so there are opportunities to grow mutual aid post-pandemic, but we also have to be realistic and say there were some real gaps that got exposed during the pandemic. So how do we kind of think about those gaps and think about, the communities that are impacted by those gaps? And I know that that's that's in the thinking of government, but it also needs to be on the minds of all of us that are trying to work at the level of community change.
Thank you.
Hey, Lynn.
We've got a question from Monica in the chat.
Sure. Where is Monica? Oh, can you speak to some of the challenges and barriers that communities faced during COVID in forming leadership and collaborating with one another? Oh my goodness, there are lots of challenges that communities and organizations, and I would say campus environments have faced, and that we've all faced as individuals, right? So certainly, one of the big challenges that is, again, one of those unequal challenges is how people have navigated this from a mental health and well-being perspective. When we talk to our 13 communities supporting youth, holistic health and well-being was an issue that came to the forefront for those communities and a priority. And we even saw that, in our own organization and with other organizations that we worked with, that, that people are really struggling through as the pandemic drags on, and particularly I think in the early part of this year, coming out of, Christmas, the January, February, kind of March period, where it's, a dark and cold time in Canada, we're feeling, and we didn't really know, how the future was unfolding. I think that there was more bleakness, and we've seen that. There's been lots of research that has been done recently by Imagine Canada and by other partners that have looked at the financial implications for community-based organizations. And we also seen, the financial implications and the weight of all of this on campus environments and their capacity to navigate this big disruption from an economic perspective, but also from a student engagement perspective, from an employee engagement perspective, and also, really thinking about, things that are real and tangible within a university environment. So, or a university and college environment, or campus environment. So those are some of the real challenges. I think the digital divide has certainly been a challenge. Another challenge that we've seen, because people have been more isolated and don't have the kind of connections and networks that they have. If you live in a home where there has been family violence, that's been even more prevalent. So we've seen an increase in that in Canada. And so all of these challenges are impacting our communities in different kinds of ways, and really putting pressure on organizations that are responding to these really direct challenges. But, you know, there's also been some real innovation. So I was working with a group in Eastern Ontario doing some strategic planning. It was a health center. And they said, you know, we were able to go to providing virtual health consultation. And the pandemic really pushed us to do that in a new and innovative way. We will probably continue to do that. We know that there will be in-person consultation coming back, but that kind of push during the pandemic enabled us to reach deeper and wider across our community and really help more people. So there are things that also, some innovations that have emerged through the pandemic. And I think it is, you know, it goes back to, I think, Amy's question or Jane's question: how do we look at the things that we did really well in our responses and leverage them forward, and how do we let go of some of the things that maybe didn't even work before the pandemic, but were just things that we kept on doing because we thought they were part of the thing that we should be doing. But now we have this opportunity to really release them and let them go. And so I think it is really important for us to be thoughtful around that before we jump too fast forward. And I think it's also really critical to look for opportunities as they emerge as well. But be strategic. Don't jump on every opportunity.
Liz, I just noticed that we have one comment in the chat from Diane, and she alludes to the really importance of how we frame things going forward. Building forward stronger as opposed to building back better. You have any comments on that?
Yeah, you know, language and framing is so important, right? You know, when we work with communities, we often ask communities, what's the narrative of your community? Because if you want to change a community, or if you want to have an impact on a community, you've got to tie into what are the stories that we tell each other about Regina or about Hamilton, you know? And then as we begin to kind of enter into the change, how do we understand that narrative, but seek to shift the narrative? And that is about the framing and reframing. Part of it is kind of considering that. And so Lorna, Elder Lorna, when you started this morning by sharing stories, I thought it was a really lovely way to start the day, because it is in many ways the work that we do has to be connected to those stories. It has to be connected to that wisdom, because unless we understand that, unless we have heard those, unless we've talked about them with each other, we don't know how to change them, right? And it's through that kind of wisdom and understanding that we really can work at transformation or, you know, real community change.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. I know we could go on forever asking you questions, and if we were at an event in person, everybody would be like running after you at the coffee table to pick your brain further. But unfortunately, as Elder Lorna has said so many times this weekend, you know, or this last couple of days, so little time, right? You know, for all these important conversations. So we're going to take a short 15-minute break now. Everybody can stay on the same link, and we'll be coming back, and it's going to be so exciting to hear what the conversations that everybody had in their individual regions yesterday. So thank you so much again, Liz, for everything you did on our behalf, which including encouraging us to get some musical entertainment. So that is on the agenda for this afternoon. We're going to have a singer-songwriter, pianist from Saskatchewan entertaining us, Jeffrey Straker. So that's coming up this afternoon as well. So we'll see